The glass clinked softly as Nikolai Petro set it down. He didn't look at the waitress when he spoke. He didn't need to. In Russian, low enough for only his table to hear, he smirked and said, "Do you notice how they stand there like statues? No thoughts. No understanding. Just uniforms." The men around him laughed under their breath. Daisy stood beside the table, completely still. Tray balanced. Posture perfect. Face calm. Eyes neutral. To Nikolai, that silence confirmed everything. He leaned back in his chair, more comfortable now, and continued, still in Russian. "I could insult her right to her face," he said, swirling the wine in his glass, "and she'd thank me for the tip." This time, the laughter was louder. Daisy heard every word. Not the tone. Not the sarcasm. The meaning. Perfectly. Her breathing stayed even. Her expression didn't change. Years of discipline had trained her for moments like this, absorbing without reacting, enduring without giving satisfaction. She had learned something important a long time ago. Silence wasn't weakness. Sometimes, it was restraint. Sometimes, it was control. Nikolai watched her out of the corner of his eye. She didn't flinch. Didn't tense. Didn't show the smallest sign of offense. To him, that meant ignorance. The language was his shield. Money was his armor. Power was his certainty. He had no reason to believe the woman standing in front of him understood the words he was using to erase her. Daisy stepped forward and refilled his glass. Her hand didn't shake. The wine poured smoothly, steadily, as if nothing had been said at all. Nikolai smirked again, satisfied. In his mind, the moment was over. The joke had landed. The hierarchy had been reinforced. He mistook her silence for emptiness. He mistook her composure for confusion. He mistook her restraint for submission. And that mistake, small as it seemed, was about to cost him far more than his pride. What Nikolai didn't know was this: the woman he was mocking had already memorized every word he'd said, and she was deciding exactly when to use them. To everyone in the restaurant, Daisy Bennett was just a waitress. Another black uniform moving between tables. Another polite smile. Another quiet voice saying, "Of course," and "right away." No one asked her name. No one wondered where she came from. No one imagined there was anything more to her than what they could see. But Daisy hadn't always been invisible. At 26, she carried more than trays and orders. She carried deadlines, overdue notices, and a constant, low-level fear she never talked about. Her mornings began in a cramped Queens apartment, where unpaid bills sat stacked beside a half-empty pill bottle labeled with her mother's name. Insulin wasn't optional. Rent wasn't flexible. And quitting this job, even for one night, wasn't a choice. What no one in the restaurant knew was that Daisy held a master's degree in Slavic languages. Russian, Polish, Ukrainian. She spoke them fluently. She had written papers on linguistic power dynamics, on how language could elevate, isolate, or destroy. Now, it paid her $18 an hour. At work, none of that mattered. Here, Daisy wasn't educated. She wasn't capable. She wasn't impressive. She was replaceable. The manager reminded her of that often. "Don't engage," he'd say. "Don't react. Smile, serve, and move on." So Daisy did. When guests ignored her, she stayed professional. When they snapped their fingers, she didn't flinch. When they talked about her as if she wasn't there, she listened and said nothing. Silence had become her armor. Not because she was afraid to speak, but because she understood something most people didn't. Reacting too soon only gave power to people who already had it. Tonight, though, the silence felt heavier. The words she'd overheard weren't casual remarks or careless jokes. They were precise, deliberate, designed to humiliate someone who couldn't fight back. And Daisy could fight back. She just hadn't yet decided if tonight was the night. She moved across the dining room with practiced ease, her expression calm, her pace steady. To anyone watching, she looked exactly like what they expected her to be. But inside, her thoughts were sharp and clear. She wasn't shrinking. She was waiting. Because when someone who's been silent for too long finally decides to speak, the moment doesn't just surprise people, it changes everything. Nikolai Petro wasn't just wealthy. He was the kind of man whose name caused small, immediate changes in behavior. When he entered the restaurant, the manager straightened his jacket. The head waiter lowered his voice. Servers exchanged quick glances and silently agreed on one thing: don't make mistakes near his table. Mistakes cost people their jobs. Nikolai had built his reputation on that fear. He bought properties the way others bought groceries, and when people got in his way, they disappeared quietly. Contracts canceled, careers stalled, doors closed without explanation. Money had taught him a simple truth: consequences were optional. He sat like someone who had never been told no. Shoulders relaxed. Movements unhurried. Confidence worn so naturally it didn't need to announce itself. The people at his table laughed when he laughed. Agreed when he spoke. Not because he was charming, but because he was powerful. And power, Nikolai believed, made him untouchable. He snapped his fingers once, casually. Daisy appeared beside him almost immediately. "Another bottle," he said, not looking at her. She nodded. "Of course." As she turned to leave, he spoke again, this time in Russian. "Look at how careful she is," he said, amused. "Like a machine programmed to obey." The men smiled. One shook his head in admiration. The manager hovered nearby, pretending not to hear, pretending not to understand. He'd learned long ago that survival meant obedience. Nikolai Petro was not a man you corrected. He was a man you accommodated. If he wanted silence, you gave it to him. If he wanted laughter, you provided it. If he wanted someone humiliated, you looked away. Nikolai leaned back in his chair, completely at ease. He had insulted politicians, executives, and rivals to their faces. He had crushed people with far more power than a waitress in an apron. What was she going to do? Complain? Quit? Disappear? In his world, people like Daisy didn't fight back. They absorbed. They endured. They moved on. That certainty made him careless. He didn't notice how still Daisy became when she returned with the wine. He didn't see the subtle tightening of her jaw or the way her eyes focused, not on him, but past him. He was too busy enjoying the comfort of never being challenged. Too busy believing he was untouchable. But the most dangerous moment for someone like Nikolai is the one where they finally meet a person who isn't afraid of losing anything. The next insult came quietly. Too quietly for anyone else to notice. Nikolai leaned slightly toward the man beside him, his voice low, casual, still in Russian. "She understands nothing," he said. "You could say anything. She'd still smile." Daisy froze for half a second. Not because she was shocked. Because this was the moment she had been expecting. She understood every syllable, every implication, every ounce of arrogance behind it. The words landed cleanly in her mind, sharp and unmistakable. There was no confusion, no guessing, no misinterpretation. Still, she said nothing. She placed the wine on the table, adjusted the glasses, stepped back into her professional posture. Around them, the restaurant buzzed softly. Forks clinked. Conversations overlapped. A laugh rose from another table. No one noticed the shift. Nikolai continued, emboldened by the silence. "She probably thinks we're discussing business," he added with a faint smile. "It's almost generous, really, letting her stand here." The men chuckled again. Daisy kept her eyes down. Her face remained calm. If anything, she looked smaller now, quieter, more forgettable. And that was exactly what made this moment dangerous. Because the audience, though Nikolai didn't realize it, now knew something he didn't. They knew the truth. They knew the language wasn't protecting him. It was exposing him. Daisy's thoughts were steady, measured. She replayed the words in her head, not with anger, but with clarity. She wasn't reacting. She was collecting. Every insult, every assumption, every careless sentence. She had learned, through years of study, that language revealed more than it concealed. People said their truest things when they believed no one understood them. Nikolai believed that completely. He shifted in his chair, relaxed, enjoying the performance of his own superiority. He had no idea that the power dynamic had already begun to tilt. Daisy took a slow breath. Not to calm herself. To prepare. Because once someone realizes they've been heard, truly heard, there's no way to take their words back. And Nikolai Petro was still talking. The most dangerous secret in the room wasn't Daisy's silence. It was the fact that Nikolai still believed it meant nothing. The wine loosened his restraint. By the third glass, Nikolai's voice grew louder, not enough to draw attention from the entire room, but enough to signal confidence. The kind that comes from never being challenged. He spoke again in Russian, this time without leaning in. "Careful," he said with a lazy smile. "If she spills that bottle, it'll cost her a week's wages." One of the men snorted. Another shook his head in amusement. Daisy felt the heat rise, not in her face, but in her chest. Still, she didn't respond. She moved smoothly, refilling glasses, clearing plates, doing exactly what was expected of her. Every movement was controlled. Every step deliberate. Nikolai mistook that control for submission. "She's listening so closely," he continued, swirling the wine again. "Like a pet waiting for approval." This time, the laughter didn't stay contained. A couple at a nearby table glanced over, curious. The manager stiffened but said nothing. He stood frozen between fear and obligation. Daisy felt the room closing in. Not physically, but emotionally. Each sentence chipped away at her dignity. Each laugh reinforced the imbalance. The insults were no longer private. They were becoming a performance. She weighed the cost in her mind. If she spoke, she could lose her job. If she stayed silent, she would lose something else. Nikolai leaned back, enjoying the moment far too much. "You know," he added, still in Russian, "this place hires well. Quite obedient. Perfect." That word, obedient, landed harder than the rest. Daisy's fingers tightened around the edge of the tray. Not in anger. In resolve. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about what he believed he was entitled to do, to anyone he considered beneath him. The pressure built, second by second. The audience felt it. The room felt it. Even the manager sensed something was wrong, though he couldn't name it. Nikolai raised his glass, satisfied. He had crossed a line and didn't even know it. And Daisy had reached the point where silence was no longer restraint. It was surrender. She took one small step closer to the table. The room seemed to hold its breath. And then, for the first time all night, Daisy made a decision that would change the balance of power forever. Daisy stopped beside the table. Not abruptly. Not dramatically. Just enough to be noticed. Nikolai was mid-laugh when she spoke. Her voice was calm. Even. Unhurried. In flawless Russian she said, "You're wrong about one thing." The laughter died instantly. Nikolai froze, the glass halfway to his lips. The men around him stared, unsure if they'd heard correctly. Daisy met his eyes for the first time. Still in Russian she continued, her tone respectful, but precise. "I understand every word you've said tonight. And you've been very clear about what you think of me." Silence spread across the table like a sudden shadow. Nikolai's face tightened. The color drained slowly, as if his body needed a moment to catch up with his mind. Daisy didn't raise her voice. She didn't rush. "That assumption," she added, "is the most expensive mistake people like you tend to make." For a second, no one moved. The room felt smaller, quieter. Even the nearby tables seemed to sense that something irreversible had just happened. Nikolai opened his mouth, then closed it. His confidence faltered, not shattered yet, but cracked. He searched her face for uncertainty and found none. She wasn't angry. She was composed. That was what unsettled him most. Daisy shifted her gaze briefly to the others at the table, then back to him. "You speak freely when you think you're unheard," she said, still calm. "It's revealing." She switched to English, not loudly, just clearly enough to carry. "Would you like anything else, sir?" The contrast was devastating. The men at the table avoided Nikolai's eyes. One cleared his throat. Another suddenly found his napkin fascinating. The manager stood rigid a few steps away, heart pounding. This wasn't in the training manual. This wasn't something he knew how to manage. Nikolai finally set his glass down. Slowly, deliberately. He looked at Daisy again, trying to reclaim control, but the balance had shifted. The room knew it. She knew it. And deep down he knew it too. Power had changed hands, not through shouting, not through spectacle, but through a single, undeniable truth. She had been listening. All along. And now that Nikolai knew he'd been heard, he had only one move left, and it would decide everything. The silence didn't break gently. It snapped. Nikolai straightened in his chair, his expression hardening as he tried to regain control of the moment. The shock faded from his face, replaced by something colder, something sharper. "You should be very careful," he said, switching fully to English. His voice was low, controlled, but tight around the edges. "You're forgetting where you are." Daisy didn't step back. She stood exactly where she was, hands relaxed at her sides, posture steady. She wasn't defiant. She wasn't apologetic. She was composed. The manager rushed forward, panic written across his face. "Sir, I'll handle this," he said quickly, turning toward Daisy. "You're done here. Go to the back. Now." The words hit harder than Nikolai's insults. This was the real threat. Jabos. Income gone. Rent unpaid. Medication missed. For a brief moment, the weight of it pressed down on Daisy's chest. Not fear, reality. Nikolai watched closely. This was the part he understood. This was the leverage he knew how to use. "You see," he said calmly, leaning back again. "Actions have consequences." The room waited. Daisy looked at the manager, not with anger, but with clarity. "Before you do that," she said evenly, "you might want to let him finish his meal." The manager hesitated, confused, uncertain. Nikolai raised an eyebrow. "And why would I do that?" Daisy met his gaze again. Her voice didn't rise, but it carried. "Because if I leave now," she said, "you lose the chance to correct a much bigger problem." That caught his attention. Nikolai smiled thinly. "You're in no position to make threats." "I'm not threatening you," Daisy replied. "I'm informing you." The words landed differently now. The manager swallowed hard. He glanced between them, sensing that this was no longer just a confrontation, it was a turning point. Nikolai studied her, reassessing. The waitress he'd dismissed no longer fit the role he'd assigned her. She wasn't backing down. She wasn't emotional. She wasn't desperate. That unsettled him. "Finish your shift," he said at last, waving a dismissive hand. "We'll discuss this later." It sounded like mercy. It wasn't. Daisy understood that too. She nodded once, not in submission, but acknowledgement, and stepped back from the table. The room slowly exhaled, conversations resuming in hushed tones. But the damage was done. Nikolai had tried to reassert control, and failed. And everyone had seen it. What Nikolai didn't realize was that this wasn't the end of the conflict. It was the moment a much larger test had just begun. The test didn't come immediately. It never does. Nikolai finished his meal in silence, his expression unreadable. But the way he watched Daisy as she moved through the dining room told her everything. This wasn't over. He was calculating. When the table finally stood to leave, Nikolai paused. "You," he said, gesturing toward Daisy. "Walk with me." The manager stiffened. Daisy felt his eyes on her back, silently begging her not to escalate things further. But it was already out of his hands. She followed Nikolai a few steps away from the table, stopping near the bar. "You're educated," Nikolai said, not as a question. "More than you let on." "Yes," Daisy replied. "Then you'll understand this," he continued. "I'm in the middle of a very sensitive acquisition. Numbers. Contracts. Foreign investors." He studied her closely. "You embarrassed me," he said calmly. "Now convince me you were worth the inconvenience." This was the real challenge. Not language. Not pride. Competence. Daisy didn't hesitate. "You're being undercut," she said. "Your partner isn't loyal. And the delay you're worried about isn't regulatory, it's intentional." Nikolai's eyes narrowed. "Explain." She did. Clearly. Methodically. She pointed out inconsistencies he'd missed, clauses designed to stall progress, numbers that didn't align unless someone was skimming off the top. No theatrics. No emotion. Just facts. The air between them changed. Nikolai stopped smiling. By the time she finished, his confidence had shifted into something else, recognition. "You've seen the documents?" he said slowly. "I don't need to," Daisy replied. "The pattern is obvious." For the first time that night, Nikolai said nothing. He looked away, pulling out his phone. A short call. A few quiet questions. The pause. When he ended the call, his expression had hardened. "You're right," he said. That admission cost him more than any insult he'd thrown earlier. He looked at her again, not as a waitress, not as an inconvenience, but as a variable he hadn't accounted for. "You're wasted here," he said at last. Daisy didn't smile. "I know," she replied. And in that moment, Nikolai realized the truth. This wasn't just a confrontation anymore. It was an opportunity he couldn't afford to ignore. The fallout came faster than Daisy expected. The next morning, Nikolai's inner circle was in chaos. Calls were made. Meetings were cancelled. One executive was quietly removed from the deal without explanation. Another stopped answering messages altogether. By noon, the truth was undeniable. There had been a betrayal. The delays, the missing funds, the carefully hidden clauses, everything Daisy had pointed out led back to one person. A partner Nikolai had trusted for years. The betrayal wasn't dramatic. There were no raised voices or slammed doors. Just contracts terminated, access revoked, and one name erased from future negotiations. Efficiency, Nikolai believed, was the cleanest form of revenge. By evening, he had saved hundreds of millions. And he knew exactly who to thank. Daisy was called into a private meeting room at the restaurant before her shift began. The manager stood stiffly nearby, suddenly polite in a way that felt unfamiliar. Nikolai entered without entourage this time. He didn't sit right away. "You were correct," he said. "No arrogance. No performance. Just fact. If you hadn't spoken up, I would have lost far more than money." Daisy listened. "I don't offer apologies lightly," he continued. "But I misjudged you." That was as close as he came. Then he did something no one expected. He offered her a job. Not a favor. Not a reward. An opportunity. A position in his firm. Real authority. Real compensation. Education funded. Security guaranteed. The manager's jaw tightened. This was the same woman he'd been ready to fire less than 24 hours earlier. Daisy didn't answer immediately. Nikolai noticed. "You don't seem surprised," he said. "I knew you'd come back," she replied calmly. "You're not the kind of man who ignores useful information." For the first time, Nikolai smiled, genuinely. The power dynamic was complete now. Not because Daisy had won, but because Nikolai had learned. She wasn't beneath him. She was ahead of him. But true victory isn't measured by titles or money, and Daisy's final choice would prove exactly that. A year later, the restaurant looked the same. Same soft lighting. Same polished tables. Same quiet hum of conversation drifting through the room. But Daisy was no longer part of the background. She stood near the entrance now, not in an apron, but in a tailored coat, her posture relaxed, her presence unmistakable. She wasn't here for business. Tonight, she was simply visiting. The manager spotted her and froze for half a second, long enough to remember who she was and who she had become. "Ms. Bennett," he said quickly, forcing a smile. "Welcome back." Daisy nodded politely and walked past him. At a nearby table, a young waitress stood nervously, clutching a tray too tightly. A guest waved impatiently, already irritated. Daisy noticed. She always noticed. When the waitress returned to the service station, Daisy stopped beside her. "You're doing fine," she said quietly. "Take a breath." The girl looked up, surprised. "Thank you," she whispered. Daisy smiled and continued toward her table. Across the city, her life was unrecognizable from what it had been a year ago. Her mother's treatment was covered. The apartment was quiet and warm. Her work challenged her, respected her. But none of that had changed who she was. She hadn't won by humiliating someone. She hadn't risen by becoming cruel. She had simply refused to stay invisible. Daisy sat down, ordered a glass of water, and glanced around the room one last time. Somewhere, laughter rose. Somewhere else, Cutlery clinked softly against porcelain. Life went on. And this time, she moved through it on her own terms. Because dignity, once claimed, is worth more than money, and no one ever forgets the moment they realize their voice has power.